All right, so now let's move on to working memory. So, what is the working memory? So, working memory is like a temporary sticky note in our brain. Working memory is a limited capacity store for retaining information for a brief period of time while performing mental operations or manipulations on that information. And so, I like to think about working memory as a temporary sticky note because we think about sticky notes are sort of like information that we need rapidly that we usually only remember when we look at that sticky note, right? So we might write something down on a sticky note and then we put that on like our on the wall or on the monitor so that the next time we need it, we're like looking at it and we're looking at it and we need that information. So working memory operates in a very similar fashion. Information in our working memory is only in our working memory so long as we are working on it. Your book might also use the term short term memory, but just to be consistent with the kind of language throughout this video lecture, we're going to be using working memory instead. And so the working memory is the bridge between the information taken in through our sensory memory, so through our sensory register, and then the more permanent information stage of long term memory. So when we think about working memory is a cognitive system responsible for temporarily holding and manipulating information in our consciousness or in our brains. It plays a crucial role in our ability to think, reason, problem solve, and make decisions in real time. So, working memory allows us to actively work with information, integrate it with our existing or our prior knowledge, and guide our behavior based on our current goals or demands. So, earlier we were talking about the assumption between the stimulus and response and these kind of mediational events. Working memory is a really nice alignment to that because when before we go out and enact a specific behavior, our brains are processing all kinds of information on, let's say we're studying and you're taking notes and you're like, oh, I should probably take notes on this video lecture or I should take notes on this particular concept. And then you go ahead and do that action. So working memory is sort of this crucial link between information we see and experience through our five senses from our sensory register. We then take in that information through the process of selective attention, and whatever information that goes through that bottleneck is now in our working memory. So, to sort of illustrate that again, information comes through our five senses, through our sensory register, and then we selectively attend to that information that's what's relevant to us, and that information now makes it into our working memory. Again, our working memory is the place where information is being worked on, temporary sticky note, right? And if that information is not actively being worked on or unrehearsed, most of that information is then lost. And so you see this uh, image up here where it says maintenance and rehearsal. Oftentimes, for information to actually make it into our long term memory, we have to actively encode and retrieve that information. We need to practice and rehearse. And so, without maintaining and rehearsing that information through encoding and actively encoding and retrieving information into actively encoding and retrieving information, it won't make it into our long term memory. And oftentimes, that information is then unrehearsed or unattended to, is often lost or forgotten. Another important thing to consider about working memory is, and the information processing system as a whole, is the central executive. So what exactly is the central executive? So this is actually, the central executive is actually the boss that drives the entire system. It's the boss of the working memory. So the central executive serves as a control center or operating center of sorts of the working memory. It allocates attention, coordinates information processing, and manages cognitive resources. So it plays a crucial role in task switching, decision making, and planning. So the central executive decides which information gets attended to and which parts of the working memory to send that information to be dealt with. So the central executive directs attention and gives priority to particular activities. So if we were to think about where the central executive fits in this information processing model, the central executive is sort of like this umbrella term all the way up at the top, and it handles everything from the sensory register, the working memory, and the long-term memory. And it's sort of like this base of operations that tells us, oh, okay, that information we should selectively attend to because that's important. Therefore, it's going to be in my working memory. But also, it's going to draw information and retrieve information from your long-term memory as well. And these are things that you've learned in the past, prior knowledge, prior experiences, and it's going to help you relate that information with what you're currently working on. We talked about assimilation and accommodation last week. And so when we're actively working on information that might be new, that might not yet align with what we already know, or maybe it aligns but it's adding a few tweaks to something that we already know or don't know. That's all happening within this information processing model, and it's our central executive that's driving the entire system. So the central executive controls the brain's executive functions. It allows us to focus our attention, oversee the flow of information, what's important, what's not important. It helps us select and control complex voluntary behaviors. And then it inhibits counterproductive thoughts and actions. So to put that into an example, I have this example or this scenario where two activities may come into conflict with one another, such as drinking boba or drinking coffee when you need to actually study. So you can imagine, let's say you're studying at like 2 a.m. at Gateway and you have an exam the next day, but you still need to finish off some studying. And you're like, should I go get boba? Or maybe I should go get coffee. And rather than crashing after a sugar rush from the boba, you make an executive decision that is preferable to buy coffee in order to concentrate and study longer at Gateway. And so that is an example of counterproductive thought. And this is where we're talking about that stimulus and response and these kind of mediational events. So our central executive is helping us think about, okay, I have an exam coming up. I probably don't need this sugar rush from boba, but maybe I need more caffeine and coffee to stay awake so I can continue to study. So that's what it means here when it like selects and controls complex voluntary behaviors, and it inhibits specific kinds of counterproductive thoughts or actions. And so to kind of wrap this section up, working memory, again, actively processes information so long as we are actively working on it. There has to be a conscious effort there. And without practice and without rehearsal, we oftentimes forget that information that we're working on. Or again, temporary sticky note, whatever we put on that note, we often don't remember what that is until we look at it again, right? And that the central executive selects the strategies for dealing with specific kinds of problems for problem solving, but it can only do a limited number of things at the same time. And again, so the working memory is actually a limited capacity store. We can't just be processing every single thing that we've experienced through our five senses through the sensory register. We selectively attend to certain kinds of information, and then we make it through our working memory because our working memory is limited. Oftentimes you might hear this other term in psychology or cognitive science of cognitive load. Our brains, especially within the working memory, can experience cognitive overload when there's so much information being processed at the same time. We've all experienced this in many different ways. Again, the example with the lecture hall. Maybe the instructor is giving way too much information. Maybe I'm giving too much information in this lecture video, and our brains are feeling a little stressed out. Our brains are feeling overloaded with sensory information. So oftentimes this is what's called cognitive load. And it's important to note that the working memory specifically is a limited capacity store. So also, to kind of reiterate the last point, the central executive deals with cognitive tasks in the working memory by integrating, so combining information from your sensory register, so that's through our auditory and visual senses and our five senses as a whole, while also retrieving information held in our large database, the long-term memory. So again, if we look at the visual here, you can imagine central executive is all the way up here and it covers all three stages. The central executive is pulling information through our sensory register. At the same time, it's drawing and retrieving information from our long-term memory. And as we do certain actions like engage in learning, engage in assimilation and accommodation through our working with information that's in our working memory, this is where the central executive is operating. And again, information that is not constantly being rehearsed or repeated or being actively encoded and retrieved oftentimes gets forgotten or lost. And we're going to be covering different ways we can encode and actively encode and retrieve information so that information does make it into our long-term memory in the following sections.